Welcome everybody to this seminar that's put on by myself and Drew Clark, who's Secretary of Communications. So thank you, Drew, for coming, and your team, and officers from the Department of Finance as well. But before we begin proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Ngunnawal people on whose land we're meeting, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and indeed future. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Nicholas Gruen with us today. Thank you, Nick. Many of you will know Nicholas, who is widely published policy economist, entrepreneur and commentator on our economy and society and innovation, and I guess driving innovation without money. Government as empresario is a good title to go with. He has regular columns in many of the newspapers around the country, and during his career, Nicholas has advised cabinet ministers, sat on Australia's Productivity Commission, chaired Australia's internationally acclaimed Government 2 Task Force, also been the chair of a number of organisations, and we're really lucky within our portfolio that he does chair the Australian Government's Australia Innovation Board, and it's probably opportune that we're starting to embark on today around innovation, given that it's Innovation Month for the Public Service next month too, Nick, of which we're championing across government. Nick's also a patron of the Australian Digital Alliance, which brings together Australia's libraries, universities and major providers of digital infrastructure, such as Google, Yahoo, and a council member of the National Library of Australia, which I was on in my previous portfolio. He's also founding shareholder and chairman of the successful San Francisco-based startup data analytics crowdsourcing platform Kaggle.com, which I had a close look at and played around with last night, but couldn't really understand it or get any problems solved that I wanted solved. But absolutely fantastic website and organisation. He also founded Lateral Economics, a consulting company of which he is now CEO, as well as Peach Financial Group. So just the huge diversity of experiences and skills this man has, building on his Bachelor of Arts in History, Graduate Diploma in Economics, PhD from ANU, Law degree, and not just sort of plain graduate degrees, these are honours and first-class honours degrees as well. So thank you very much, Nick, and we feel very privileged to have you here. The presentation this afternoon will focus on how innovation policy in the current age of fiscal constraint will allow governments to drive more innovation and productivity with less, and we've heard that on many occasions. And the presentation will explore this landscape of innovation without money, so I'm certainly looking forward to it. A key part of the presentation will be exploring Nick's ideas about public goods privately provided and the scope for new kinds of public-private partnerships. And although we're used to thinking that public goods must be produced by governments, there is a fundamental and growing class of public goods emerging from private interactions. And new public goods like Twitter, Facebook, Wikipedia thrive on the internet and have ushered in a new age. But there must exist other public goods which could be brought into existence by the right kind of partnership between public and private endeavours. The talk will explore this new terrain, providing examples whilst expounding the principles on which such partnerships should be based. And of course, at the end, Nick's happy to take questions, so and Drew Clark will facilitate our Q&A discussion. Today's presentation is also being filmed and will be available on the Department of Communications YouTube channel. And once available, I encourage you to share the presentation with colleagues who could not attend today. And we did have an absolute sellout, and I think, Marianne, Steve, we had to turn quite a few people away. So feel privileged, like I will be, listening to Nick. So thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Glenys. Well, the description of what I'm going to talk to you about is kind of accurate, but you might get the wrong impression, because it's not going to be a kind of synoptic, how do we do this innovation thing without money? It's going to be a bunch of ideas. And I guess I'm reminded of an occasion when I was, don't laugh, thinker in residence for the Department of Education, Training and various other things. And I would often be taken into rooms and shown 5 strategic dot points and asked to help on those. And I don't think it's possible. It's sort of, so productivity is like happiness. You don't get there by trying to sort of do more of it. You get there by thinking about things on their merits and solving problems and inventing problems. You invent a problem when you see an opportunity and then you realise there was a problem. And so I'm going to talk to you about a class of, or several classes of opportunities that I think of as really, really big, and they come from a very interesting, I think, a very interesting line of thinking. So that's an outline of what I'm going to talk about, and because I'm going to go at a fair pace, I will move right along. So there's an informal definition of a public good, and there is a more technical definition of a public good. That is a good which is non-excludable and non-rival. And what do those things mean? Well, excludability is something which we can exclude people from this room, but once you're in the room, my speech is unexcludable. So if I want to charge you money, I'll better do it at the door. I can't do it in here because you can watch anyway, just as the ships can pass by the lighthouse. And rivalrousness is, it relates to the quality if you have something, somebody else doesn't have it. So here's my watch. If I've got it, you haven't got it, but there's an image and people here can look at it and people there can look at it. So it's a very different thing. Now, many of you will be familiar with the term a free rider problem. We spend a lot of our time talking about free rider problems, and there are free rider problems in the economy. I'm going to get my laser pointer out off my key ring. But an expression that is much less common, but actually more important, is the free rider opportunity. And if you look at that graph, excludability, lack of excludability creates a free rider problem. Non-rivalrousness creates an incredible free rider opportunity. So the non-rivalrousness of this presentation in the room means that it's completely free for every person other than me, if you like, or other than the first person that it's made for. The marginal cost of every other one of these units is zero. What an amazing opportunity. That's what has got us down from the trees. We weren't actually ever in the trees, but you know what I mean. That's what has got us to the 10th floor of a building, which there weren't any 10th floors of buildings a few thousand years ago. That was from seeing other people with ideas and copying them. And yet we talk about public goods as a problem because we've been focused on non-excludability. And there are problems with public goods. There's problems with building roads. Who's going to build them if the government isn't going to build them? There's problems with building the defence forces. Who's going to build them if the government doesn't? And if the government is building them, it's very hard to work out how much people want them because they're not paying for them as they go. So there are lots of problems, but think of the opportunities, the public goods opportunities, which we're just becoming aware of. Although Thomas Jefferson told us about them a long, long time ago in words that were more enthusiastic than any modern statesman, I would have thought. He was aware of this explosion of possibility that was coming upon our species. So these are a whole bunch of public goods that just flew into existence. And something else remarkable has happened, which is that if you think about Google, by the back of my envelope, Google creates about $1 trillion of value every year for the global economy. And the poor suckers managed to get by on the smell of an oily $60 billion rag of revenue, just scraped off the $1 trillion that they make. Now, isn't that remarkable that Google is 94%, if I've got my sums right, 94% a gift to the world, and they're all as rich as their wildest dreams. That's a very different model to the model that Adam Smith was thinking about when he talked about the butcher, the baker and the brewer, because that's 100% value model. 100% of the value goes into the loaf of bread and it goes to the buyer. That's a simple world. It's a much easier world to work out what to do in as well. So the other amazing thing is that Google could, and all these other platforms, they are actually excludable. But they have foregone the free rider problem, foregone dealing with the free rider problem in order to grasp the much greater free rider opportunity. Isn't that amazing? And there are these kinds of things all over the place. This is a close personal friend of mine. I've already mentioned him. My talks rarely get into more than about the fourth or fifth slide before he makes a visit, sometimes unintended. And he wrote a book that you will probably have heard of called The Wealth of Nations. Well, he also wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments 17 years beforehand, and that was essentially about a public good, the public good of culture, the public good that enabled us all to walk into this room, all to obey a whole bunch of implicit social rules, which mean that we can share the cup of tea at the end. We're not going to be fighting over anything really. It's just like the road rules, turning something which could be a real bun fight into an amazingly smooth piece of clockwork. And although the government sits behind the public good of decent people dealing decently with each other, we invented that. And then the government came along and said, yes, by the way, you're not allowed to kill people and you've got to obey the road rules and so on. But these things emerge. These are emergent public goods. And there is one other absolutely fundamental public good in life, and that is language. And that's simply emerged from human life itself. There's only one country I know of where the government gets involved. That's not this one, that's France, where you're not supposed to say blue jeans if you're speaking French and stuff like that. And Adam Smith actually wrote a book or a treatise about the emergence of language. And his model for markets, for culture and for language was this model of emergent public good, although he didn't use that terminology. And the other thing I've kind of discovered as I've gone on this little journey thinking about this stuff is that we have a very impoverished idea of governments build public goods and the market builds private goods. And yes, sort of at the extremes, that's completely true. But what's much more interesting is that there is always an ecology between public and private goods. And in this room right now, there are public goods. We all know that we're part of a group and we all know that we owe certain things to the group. And at the same time, we all understand that we have our own private role in this room, which might differ, but we all understand that. In a football team, it's the same. In a nation, it's the same. And when things go wrong, they've usually gone wrong because this ecology somehow isn't working out the way it might. And this is an example of an ecology of public and private goods, where this is basically Adam Smith and Friedrich Hayek's story of how the price system, which is an emergent public good, simply emerges from it's sort of an ecological product of life going on in a particular kind of way. And there are those, and in the late 80s it became popular to have the heretical thought that perhaps we could make everything a private good. And well, it was a sort of nice idea, but we do have some experience with worlds with only private goods. And that's as close as we've got to them, and they don't really work very well. And that's something that my friend understood as well. So I call this, so I've just given some voice to that idea of this fractal ecology of public and private goods. And you might be interested to think about what drives Google. How does Google work? Google is an ecology of public and private goods. It's offering you a private good. It's offering you something which is going to be of use to you privately. You go onto it and it's listening, it's watching. And if it serves up a list of 10 things to click on and you click on the third and a few other people click on the third, guess what happens? Your private good is converted into a public good, and on we go. And the same kinds, and so that's how Google does it, using logic, using utility, and Facebook does it using affect. The same kind of thing. And this was all going on the African savannah when we evolved as a species in a different kind of way. But it's the same kind of story. So this is Facebook, this is Google, and this is Wikipedia, all of those things. And this is an opportunity to say that if you were trying to run any of those platforms for the good of the world, which is what governments do, that's what they're supposed to do, would you be trying to, what would you think would be higher on your list of priorities? If you can do the same thing at a lower cost, that would be obviously and self-evidently a worthwhile thing to do. And if you can fulfill your mission better, which would be more important? Generally speaking, they're both important, but generally speaking, running the platform is much more important because there's so much more public value, there's so much connected to it. That is not in any sense a criticism of anyone who wants to lower the costs of delivering government, but it is to say, I had lunch with a very senior Australian business person the other day, and they said, well, the government is 30% of our economy, so it's got to be an important part of the productivity story. Well, I informed her that that wasn't quite right. Yes, of course, there is something absolutely evident about the fact that if you can keep doing something at a lower cost, why wouldn't you? But that is the size of government measured roughly in terms of value added in Australia. So most of government is cash transfers, and that's the 30%. And guess what? You can't make them any more efficient, except possibly taking a few basis points out of the transaction with a bit of decent policy work on the banks, but I won't go into that. And that's what it looks like if we take away health and education. So it's really important for government to think about itself mostly as a platform, and it's a large and expensive platform, so if you can cut costs any way you can, that's just great. But the mission is more important than the costs. So the implications of these ideas, I think, go in two directions. I kind of startled myself with the fact that this thinking that I was doing connected up these two worlds that I was thinking about, digital, and you can see some of the implications for digital, and as chairman of the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, social capital is extremely like this because it's sort of connected up everywhere. It's like Google. If you save a family from going into crisis, if a state government does that, it's saved some costs, but so much more other things have been improved. If a school helps a family by helping a child with remedial mathematics, think of all the benefits that radiate out, just like Google. It's the same story. I'm not going to talk much more about social capital. If you want to have me back, I'd be happy to blow in your ear about that as well. Okay, so we have this world that I've sketched out for you, which is traditional public goods, or the free rider problem over there, and the free rider opportunity over here. And we've found this burgeoning of new things over here. And so here they sit, and we have this world, and now I'm going to say to you something else, which is, hang on, I'll go back. So what's happened here, I'll stay near the microphone, I guess, but what's happened here is that these are all the easy. This is all the easy stuff. These are all the public goods that either simply emerge and run themselves, like language, or that with a little bit of money, $60 billion as it is with Google, or $12 million, I think it is with Wikipedia, which is raised philanthropically, with a small amount of money, the thing takes off and it becomes a public good. So there must be a class of goods, and maybe it's really large, of public goods that are sort of languishing, that want to come into existence, but they can't do it on advertising. They can't do it on a freemium model. They can't get enough money from philanthropy. And so I spent a couple of years looking for these things. And I came up with hokey little examples. The National Library newspaper digitisation website, which is a fantastic thing, absolutely fantastic thing, where you go and you look at newspapers which have been digitised, and if you find a mistake in the character recognition, you can correct it yourself. Guess how many lines of code, lines of text have been corrected since it went live in 2007? 140 million. That's pretty cool. But it's not like Google, okay? I wanted a Google. I want something that's going to show this idea isn't just a fancy idea, it's a big idea. So that's me as Urbain Le Verrier. You see, I've got a lively imagination. You've already seen that I go back to the 18th century quite a bit. This is the 19th century. And this guy says, you know what? He says, I've been looking at the way this planet moves, and I reckon if you look there, you're going to find another planet. And that's almost exactly what happened the next night in Berlin. So that's Uranus and that is Neptune, and that's how Neptune was discovered. And so I've been looking for my Neptune, and I looked for quite a while, and then I saw Anne Wojcicki talk about 23andMe in San Francisco at a Health 2.0 conference. So 23andMe is a consumer genomics company. You send them $99, and they send you a plastic kit that you spit into. I'm told that you have to spit quite a lot of spit into it, but I haven't done it myself. But that's the worst that will happen to you. After that you get an email and you get a page on their website, and it helps you do a bunch of things of the social networking variety, like find ancestors. If you want to find ancestors, that's not always a good thing. But the big thing is that you can, that this is a partial genomic sequencing of your genome, and it will identify it may identify certain susceptibilities. If you know that you're unusually susceptible to bowel cancer, you will choose to get screened more often than the normal amount. So then I realised I had my public-private partnership when I was told at the time the cost was $299. The number of customers that 23andMe had at the time was 180,000. They've now got 600,000 on the back of getting $50 million in the bank and cutting the price to $99. Their target market must be 2 billion people who can be helped by this for $99. That's not really working all that well, is it? And I immediately, those who know me won't be surprised by this, went straight down the front and said to Anne Wojcicki, have I got a deal for you? And explained this idea of a public-private partnership between 23andMe, and you shouldn't think of it as 23andMe, but a service like 23andMe, and think of the Australian health system. Now, they can't think of the Australian health system in America because they're Americans and they think of their own health system, which isn't so much a system as a kind of a collection of things. And we have a system which is a collection of things and a central insurer, which is capable of doing population-based activity, centralised insurance funding, and a bunch of other really worthwhile things. So America, interestingly, is kind of at the forefront of a lot of of consumer-based health innovation without any kind of sense of its systemic significance. So the model here, I think, is just completely obvious, that subject to a cost-benefit analysis, and I know that sometimes they cost-benefit analyses go through cycles of being popular with different parties depending on where they are in their lives. But subject to a cost-benefit analysis, I would assert that I would be very, very surprised if having the genome of an Australian wouldn't be worth $99, in fact a lot more than $99, and it would cost less in bulk to get that genome, and therefore for Medicare to bulk bill it, and for the health system to nudge people into it by simply saying when you go to the doctor, do you want to take advantage of this free service? And if you don't, that's fine. You just opt out. If you want to take advantage of it, sign here, tick here, give us your email address, and in a couple of weeks' time, a spit here, and in a couple of weeks' time, you will be in the system. We could get millions, and this is a tiny fraction of 1% of the target market. You would think you could get 60 or 70% of Australians signed up to this. And the value of it as a research asset, the value of it connected up to the unit patient record for diagnostic, for pharmacovigilance would be huge. Here's an example of something that they'd done just with their 180,000 customers. They had replicated 180 genetic associations known in the literature. So what happens is they look at your genome, they get you to fill out quite elaborate surveys about, whether what your mother and father died of, and whether you've got a bad back and all this kind of stuff. And they've got all this data, and then they can simply do a correlation in their database and work out where likely associations are. They replicated 180 of these genetic associations. It costs about 300,000 or 400,000 to do one of those the normal way. So in a report that's being released on Thursday that I'll talk a little bit more about, I worked out on the back of an envelope that is a productivity improvement of 10,000%. So that's productivity, surely. So that's basically the structure of what I'm calling public-private partnerships 2.0. The private sector builds a service. The public sector contributes its resources. This is the model of 23andMe. It might be different in different cases. With giving access to public networks with nudges, deliberately getting out of the way and not putting up roadblocks like the FDA in the United States has, which has just declared 23andMe a medical device, and it now has to go through a long regulatory treadmill. Now, of course, we should regulate it so that it's properly delivered, but I doubt that that's being handled in a sensible way. So there's actually an opportunity for here because they're looking around. And financial internalisation is another part of it. And the final point is one I want to stress. This, I am not saying to you, as lots of people have in the past, why isn't government more like business? Governments and business are different. There are ways in which each can learn from the other, but they are different. And if this cannot be done according to the basic traditions of government, government objectivity, government not playing favours with commercial interests, then it shouldn't be done because that's more important than a bit of productivity. The thing is, it can be done. We need to invent the processes by which it would be done. And you can imagine what they are. In this case, you would have a tender and you would also make a whole range, you would require a whole range of undertakings from the party that was privileged to become the public, the anchor, the anchor in this public-private partnership. You would also re-tender it every 5 years, and the data would be transferable, and so on. There are lots of there are plenty of things to be thought about, but they're not that hard to think about. We can start today. Basically, we can start. We can understand the kinds of moves we ought to make. So I'm now going to go through a bunch of more minor examples of public-private partnerships. This is an old one, which is Fix My Street, where a civil society, effectively this was a philanthropic in the UK, set up a website on which people could record potholes in their neighbourhood and so on, and that would be fed back to the local council to fix those things. Again, a different interface between public and private, and a useful one. That's a for-profit version of exactly the same thing, and this was a prototype we built in the Government 2.0 task force called It's Buggered, Mate. and you write in there what's buggered, where it's buggered, and your own address, your own email address, so that you can help track the unbuggering. That didn't actually make it to full production, but it actually was a kind of working prototype at the time. This is a pretty interesting thing, and this is an attempt to, the way I think about this is trying to fast track with sensor data, which will be the data of the future, what it took the electricity industry about 40 years to go through. So what happened in electricity was that by about the 20s, a lot of businesses had generators out the back, and they were all based on different systems. Some were AC, some were DC, some were this volts, some were that volts, and it was massively inefficient. And over the course of about a decade, this was transferred onto the grid with a standardized system. And once you've got that going, then if someone's good at generation, they can set up and generate and then send it out on the grid. So what's happening here is that sensors for oyster farmers, for viticulturalists, for fish farmers, for really anyone out in the environment are supplied to those farmers on a lease basis, and therefore supplied in a way that sensor data can be used and reused again and again, and can ultimately become a kind of platform on which apps can be built. People will find ways to use this data that will amaze us, that we weren't expecting, in exactly the same way that we've got 1 million apps on, or 1 million. How many apps have we got on iPhones? Does anyone know? It's something like 1 million. It's an awful lot. And that isn't innovation without money, but it's innovation with a very small amount of money compared with the amount that it might do. And you could fund it, and again, when it comes to small amounts of money, it's probably most sensible to fund them through central revenue, general revenue, but you can also fund them through industry levies and any number of other makeshifts. This is Murmur. Murmur is a employee engagement tool, cloud-based. It's a startup in Melbourne, and it's a very natty little tool that which can be customised in various ways, and you take employees through a survey of how well they think they're being managed effectively, and a whole bunch of other things. They've sold it to Adobe and to Box in Silicon Valley, and they're selling it to businesses around the world. And the idea here is for a government to say to this company, although it isn't to this company, it might be done through some sort of tender process, what would it take for you to make this tool available for, they actually have a free version available, it's a very cut down version. What would it take to make available a proper version of this for free to all businesses in Victoria, if you're to small businesses in Victoria, if you're the small business minister for Victoria, or to small businesses in Australia, if you're the relevant minister for the Commonwealth? I don't think it would cost a lot. That's actually the most efficient way to deliver the service, just straight out of an economic textbook, because price equals marginal cost, but you get an additional benefit. And the benefit that you get several benefits, but you get a standard, so most businesses will report to that standard, so then then comparisons can be made, and the government will, as part of that private-public partnership, take on board that data and find all sorts of ways to use it to help people work out what makes companies, what drives these kinds of results. There are all sorts of ways in which that could be useful, all sorts of ways in which something provided as a private good can be hugely more valuable delivered as a public-private good. This is an example of a website which is in construction, and the builder of this website has been so it's an internal marketplace, and it's being built for, or early customers are, I think, KPMG, and consulting companies. And the person who's building this website came to see an Australian government agency that will remain nameless. The person who saw it said, "This is exactly what we need. We really should have a tool like this, but we couldn't possibly get it because it isn't a product that we could tender for, because this is the only one of its kind." So the sort of thing that the sort of way we need to try and get that through, we need to think about purchasing and about purchasing with elements of product development much more than we have, and the Victorian market validation program, which was then replicated at the Commonwealth level in a pilot scheme, seemed to be a good start to trying to learn about how to do that. That's another similar company, Declaration of Interest. I have one in it, and that does optical character recognition of PDF files for the purposes of gaining semantic meaning out of them. What does all that mean? It means that if you're putting in an application for the dole, it will improve document handling. It's being built for mortgage brokers in Australia and around the world, but there are lots of government uses for it. But there's a difficulty in government becoming a developing purchaser, if you like, because it's not a mature product. It's not a mature product class. So I think I've given you the example of 23andMe, which I think is a kind of a hugely exciting one. But I actually think there's the scope for a really fantastic innovation program which has incredibly low costs, and it would be around the new interfaces that are coming into play simply by using existing technology and making things work a lot better. That's roughly what Silicon Valley does. It's not a high-tech place. There are bits of it that are high-tech like Intel, but most of it, Facebook, Apple are not high-tech. They're design shops. They're using existing technology in fantastic ways at the interface, connecting things by building a really clever, socially inclusive interface. And by socially inclusive, I don't mean like Facebook as in social, as in lovey-dovey. I mean general, not point to point, but generally some general platform. So let me give you some examples. A very clear example. It's such a good example that it's going, I suspect it will go perfectly well on its own, but this should be on rocket fuel right now. What does this do? It takes the silly process that we have for giving your kids permission to go on excursions and writing down their allergies and all that sort of stuff, which is paper-based, wastes a lot of time, and it does it on an app. And so if your child is on an excursion and they fall ill or hurt themselves, it's a couple of button clicks away to know, for the teacher who is on the app, on their smartphone, to know what their allergies are, what their doctor and specialists are, who to ring, all really incredibly simple. So you can imagine. I hope that this isn't. I'm sure this isn't going to push you into any territory that's unfamiliar to you. You can imagine that some schools would do this and some schools are doing this, but it's just taking quite a bit of time. So we could have a government scheme to sort of, in one way to think about it would be to say to reverse the onus of proof. The onus of proof, it's even in the doctrine of negligence, it says if you do what everybody else is doing, you're safe. So if nobody else is doing it, do it if you want to, but you're okay if you don't do it. We could be saying there are these technologies around. Within a year, we want you to have evaluated them and to have implemented them. And if you haven't implemented them, that's fine, but you need to do due diligence on the process of not jumping into this space and moving along. And again, one might also say that 0.25% of the turnover of these sectors should be spent on on being an accepting interface for innovation, because a great deal of innovation it lives and dies on the environment in which it is released. And so if we can just improve that a little, we can do amazing things. So that's what comes up on your smartphone if you're off on an excursion with CareMonkey. And there are other apps. Again, I stress I'm not saying this should be done with CareMonkey, but CareMonkey is one possible entrant in this, and you can imagine how much the whole industry doing these things would get a shot in the arm from governments acting more vigorously, and how much benefit it would be for them overseas to say that this was adopted by 60% of Australian schools and so on. So
this is Cloudphone 3G. It's a single-button smartphone for healthier, safer families. It's designed to be the perfect companion for seniors and young children. But it's more than just a phone. It's a smart care system that constantly monitors your loved one's well-being. And our unique cloud technology keeps the whole family connected. Cloudphone 3G is revolutionizing how we care. Here's how it works. Advanced voice controls make calling anyone simple. Just touch and talk.
Who do you want to call?
Call my daughter.
Connecting.
Hi, Mum.
Say a panic word, or press and hold the call button to create a family call. It's an instant conference call that's perfect for emergencies and shares your location while you talk. Cloudphone also monitors falls and lack of movement. It makes everyday living safer. If an event is detected, it asks the wearer if they're okay before calling for help.
Are you okay?
I'm okay.
If they're fine, it returns to sleep and doesn't cause a fuss. Cloudphone 3G also monitors physical activity. Lifestyle Analytics gives you the information you need to make informed decisions. See the real impact of changes in care, medication, or behaviour on physical activity, and prevents small health problems from growing into big ones. Cloudphone is great for loved ones on the go too. Our SafePath technology automatically monitors regular transit activity, like travelling to and from school. If your loved one leaves the approved path, get an instant notification and view their location on your phone. Plus, with automated check-in, you'll know the moment they arrive home safely.
So I think you can see how exciting that is. You'll hear Australian accents in the video. The guys who have come up with that were in Brisbane, and they came up with it. One of their great aunts was slipped in the shower and was, in pain, wasn't able to get up for several hours, and they thought we must be able to do better than we can at the moment. They're not in Australia anymore. They're in Kansas. In the Sprint Accelerator in Kansas City, only one Australian angel investor invested in them. But I think you can see that technology like that, there's so many it's such simple technology. It's not high tech. There's nothing high tech about that. That is just rolling off it's like electricity in the 1920s. It's all done for you, and it's a question of how are we going to apply this. And we have these huge systems with huge amounts of money, and they can lower their own costs by adopting these kinds of things. And so we have to find ways of getting that to happen. And I think we could build a really fantastic innovation program around that. That's a very prototype, a very recent example of some similar work being done by Quanticare Technologies, which is in the Melbourne University Accelerator. I found out about it at lunch yesterday, and I told them to send me a picture of it. I told them it wasn't the greatest picture, but what it does is it's on a walker, and it detects the pressure being put on the walker and falls, and so it does something similar to the example that you saw earlier. And you can imagine you could put lots of sensors and one of the things that video didn't point out about the device that they built is that it's actually quantified. It's quantified self for the aged. So what they're going to do with that device is they're going to build a whole lot of biometric data and then start saying how can we use it to predict when somebody might fall and all that kind of stuff. And they've also I've seen if anyone's interested, I can send you a picture of the next generation, which is fantastic looking, as second generations of things tend to be. And it's a kind of a plastic necklace that's a very elegant looking necklace that just comes around there, which you're much less likely to take off when you get in the shower the way you would probably do with that prototype. So it just seems to me that this is just waiting to happen. I haven't seen a government anywhere in the world that has said, let's really go after this. And if I'm wrong and it doesn't work out, well, we won't have spent a lot of money. We won't have spent any money doing it. So I think it's a bit of a case of what's there not to like, to quote Kimmy from Kath and Kim. Here is HealthKit, declaration of interest. I have an interest in this company, and it is a free, medical practice software, and makes its money from SMS reminders and credit card payments and things like that. Now, we are, at the moment, policy is trying to push doctors and allied health into computer, even now, lots of doctors and allied health are not fully computerised, and more to the point, online. And once they're online, fully online with online systems, the data that you can get out of that is extremely powerful. If a medical practitioner of any kind, a GP or a psychologist or whatever, wants to know which software package to use, that isn't a very easy problem for them to solve. And I suggest that governments need to step away from their default, which is, oh, we couldn't do anything about that because that would be picking winners, ring the industry association, to say that it is an important part of the public good to have a system that we've now invented on the net with TripAdvisor and Yelp and any number of other sites, to have a system which helps to harvest the views of consumers and helps to inform that process. That can be an objective system. It wouldn't be a system in which the government came up with a preferred provider. It would be a system that the government helped to bring into existence, may not even mandate, might just sort of work with the industry to bring it into existence, to say, hey, we need a TripAdvisor for medical software, because if we have that, we'll get better medical software, we'll get much better take-up, we'll get standards developed, and so on. So this is a whole bunch. I haven't been through all of my repertoire of what I call government as impresario. And the idea of an impresario is, of course, someone who makes fantastic things happen off the smell of an oily rag. So that's the idea. I can go into any of those things, but I wanted to move right along, and I will go into another area, which is open data, and it's somewhat related, and where I'm releasing a report that we've done for the Media Network to feed into the G20 process on Thursday morning. But there you go. That's a number from McKinsey's, that open data is worth $3 trillion a year to the global economy. That's the open data to come, not already. It's worth more than that, one would imagine. So what is open data? Well, that's again from McKinsey, and you can see there that there is only a very small part which is government data, and then there's all this other data, and I've intimated what that data could be: quantified self-data from that device, all sorts of other things. And so if we can find ways that respect both privacy and ownership of data to get more of that data out there, we can do great things. Firstly, we can do a better job of releasing public sector information. As the Commission of Audit pointed out, we haven't been too good at that, and I'll show you some examples. There's also our research data, but there are a whole lot of other things we can look at. That's a graph, and we've got accessibility here and different data sources. Those circles correlate roughly with the circles there, not entirely. But take this one, for instance. We've got most closed, accessibility, individual genome. Well, see what I mean? You can find ways to build systems in which that data comes out. Anonymized, so it doesn't compromise people's privacy, but all that data is now, possibly a better term that McKinsey sometimes uses is not open data, but liquid data, data that can travel places and be used and have value there, even if it isn't completely open. And I'll give you another example of employer performance. I've talked to you about that already to some extent. And there are ways one could imagine of getting that open. And that's a set of repertoires that could be used at the level of government to help this data ecology be more open. Sense-T is another example, to get in and preempt the architecture, so the architecture is much more open than closed. This is, when I did the Government 2.0 task force in 2009, I would say, not that people were collecting these kinds of figures, but I would say that there were 3 countries regarded as clear leaders in that agenda: the UK, the US, and Australia. And it is quite clear now that within the G20 we are 3rd or 4th, but amongst other countries we're 7th or 8th, and we have definitely slipped off the pace, particularly with regard to the UK, which comes up the top of almost all of these things. And they're really doing remarkable things. And there's no reason why we couldn't be as well. That's their My Data website, where there is a partnership of all of those organisations, public and private, to empower citizens to authorise the use of their data to go to other places, if you know what I mean. So someone might say, if you give me your shopping data, I will send you specials and find better deals for you, but it's up to you. So they're building this whole architecture in which that kind of thing can happen. And that's about the only way we can deal with the ways in which privacy concerns stop data flowing, which is to absolutely respect them, and then to build the architecture around people controlling their data. We don't. So here's some examples in Australia where we have made an open data declaration. But for instance, in the State of the Service report, we publish lots of data, but it isn't data that could reflect on any particular agency. That's not the way they do it in the United States. And guess which agency came near bottom of the rankings for employee satisfaction at about the time of Hurricane Katrina, before Hurricane Katrina? FEMA. So this stuff has genuine forensic and managerial value. Okay, no, hang on, stop that. So this is a site which a guy called Felix Barbalet, who worked in the tax office, set up to generate value, private value for himself and public value for the community and his customers in understanding Commonwealth employment data that was public. So I'll just show you.
APSjobs.info is a new information product for any business in Australia that interacts with the federal government. If you're a technology vendor, it gives you access to the name and phone number of around 80,000 senior APS decision makers, and you can instantly find those relevant to your product. If you're a recruiting firm, it gives you access to the name and employment history of around 120,000 APS employees. You can search for candidates based on their job title, department, location, position type, APS level, and much more. You can view detailed job specs and instantly see who was appointed into a position. If that person has joined or moved in the APS in the last 5 years, you can see their job history too. This is an incredibly rich information source that your competitors are already using. Information is pivotal, so don't let your business slip behind.
So that data, yes, I know there's a few sideways glances around the room. So that data is acquired from that website, which is PDFs and Word files. And you can imagine people don't spend much time on that website. If you look at what happens when they visit that website, they stay longer and they look longer, rather like Seek, but not like the public sector version of that thing. And so that's the page in Australia, and that's what it looks like in the United Kingdom, which is a very elaborate invitation for you to get the data pretty much in any format you want. They're trying to solve the interface problem. They're trying to make the thing flow, to make the data liquid. And the value here is very substantial, but I'm afraid the business isn't keeping up scraping the PDF files because they keep changing the format of the PDF files, and it costs them too much to reprogram everything to get the information off the PDF files. So I guess he can just set the website up for UKPS jobs, UKCS jobs, I guess, and add the value there from here. Let's ask a naive question. Why don't firms release their employee engagement data? Well, that sounds obvious, doesn't it? Because they might be embarrassed by there might be things that embarrass them. But that doesn't answer the question of why the best ones don't release that data. And I think the reason they don't release the data is that there is no standard to report to. Because if PricewaterhouseCoopers is doing a better job than Deloitte, and it shows that in a survey, it's very easy to design questions to release that look just as good as those answers. So that opens up the possibility, again, public good, standard is an emergent public good most of the time, to convene standard setting, voluntary standard making and reporting. Governments could report to that standard to help it get going. The ABS could do a survey of firms in Australia, which would give firms a complete lie of the land of if they wanted to use that standard where they were placed. And of course, they would then be free to report that against the standard, and they could make claims like in the top quartile in terms of family friendliness, in the top decile as far as rewards, as far as career paths or whatever. That would strengthen the market for good management. I'm sure the stock market would take an interest in that data because you would find correlations between results, and more the data would come out because you'd built it in a way to get it out. It wouldn't all come out, but it would be a lot better than it is now, and it would be free. So I think that's a hugely beneficial thing. Now, the report, we've just done this report on open data, which I mentioned, and we tried to estimate the value of these kinds of policies, plus the fact that governments have got a lot of suasion or control over health and education. So they can do a lot of this stuff and say, get a standard together and report against it. So we gave nothing. So that stuff that I showed you of Felix Barbalet's site, which should be fixed up if you got the policy right, we counted that for nothing. We said if you have better job matching, you're going to lower stress at work. Let's say it's between 5 and 10%, so that's some money. We gave 0 for productivity growth, which I think, well, we just didn't have we don't know enough about this to be sure, and we did the job quite quickly. But we did find something about the benefits of better job matching in education. Essentially, if you get better job matching in education, you get an effect equivalent to an increase in teacher quality. And we know something about the value of improvements in teacher quality, and we said that if you got 1/4 of those benefits, that would give you that kind of result. So that's our rough calculation, a huge underestimate of the efficiency benefit from those kinds of policies. The mathematicians, the arithmeticians in the room will be wanting to know something, and the answer is it's a rounding issue. Okay, And that's a whole bunch of what we did is we took the themes of the G20, and those themes are mentioned there, and we sketched out, if you like, what we thought was a reasonable estimate of the sorts of benefits that you might get from open data. And all of these things cost essentially nothing. So this is the repertoire of open data, and I've mentioned some of those things to you. And these are doing exactly the same thing, which is building public goods from private resources, just by doing things a little smarter. So a few other things. There is a long list of these things. I should have said at the outset, I'm not speaking on behalf of Innovation Australia. I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone but myself, but we are looking at this agenda of innovation without money. And I think there are just lots of examples, and I wanted to give you a very strong look at one good area. But let me just take you through a couple of other things, and then I will finish. And according to my watch, I'm pretty much within my 50 minutes, and then I'm happy to take questions. Okay, so what's happening there is that a man is firing at a Segway. And why is he doing that? Because in the army some years ago, somebody said, hey, we're doing target practice the way we did it back in World War II. Surely we can do better than that. So they rang up, they managed to make contact with some software engineers at the University of Sydney, and the software engineers went and bought themselves some Segways, armour-plated them, stuck a mannequin on them that can take something like 20,000 rounds from a 303. How you build a mannequin that can do that, I'm not too sure. And started building these things sell for about 100,000 each, I think. And they can be programmed to behave in different kinds of ways, and they can do complete scenarios of the kind you saw. And that's a business sort of built out of nothing, okay, built out of an idea. Government isn't 30% of the economy, as you've heard. Most of it is making payments, but it is 14% of the economy. And imagine if all the public servants, all the people working for the public felt empowered to say, hey, we could do this a different way. There is technology everywhere. I'm a bit of a fan of low tech. This is low tech, effectively. There's nothing bleeding edge about any of that, and yet it's worth $5-10 million a year as a business already, and it's a great thing to have a crack at. A couple of other things. Well, regulation. I think we've got our approach to regulation. Governments around the world have tried this idea that they've tried what I call the Michelangelo theory of regulation. And Michelangelo said that when someone asked him how he sculpted those magnificent sculptures, he said, well, I just take the marble that doesn't belong there away, and there you've got the sculpture. And that's roughly the approach we've got to regulation. If we've got a strong enough barrier against new regulation, we'll be left with fantastic regulation. There are lots of problems with that, but I think we could try to regulate more on behalf of innovators. Because innovators in today's world fight their way through a thicket of what I call the death of 1,000 cuts. Just try and organise a school fete with sandwiches. So we have to try and think about that for innovators. So not a sort of full frontal assault on regulation, which becomes highly ideological, and it has just never been very successful. And try to think about how we help innovators clear the path for new things through regulation. That's one example of what happens with our current approach. I'll let you just mull on that. And that was me asking that question. And that was the Federal Office of Road Safety saying we can't really afford to make our regulation very up to date because that would require a regulatory impact statement. So take Christopher Joyce setting up Rismark. Rismark is a financial instrument that you use to finance your house and you don't pay interest on it. You don't pay interest on it? No, you don't. You pay twice the capital gain that you made on the house back. So you pay no interest, and if they lent you 10% of the house, you pay 20% of the capital gain back to them when you sell the house. And that was $4 million of legal fees and I think 2.5 years to get through the regulatory maze. This is the lot of innovators, and we have major project facilitation because we can see the project. It's a $400 million pulp mill, and we say, we're your buddy, we'll help you get through the hoops. We should do it for innovators. So here's another example, Earth Sanctuaries. It was the prohibition on exporting native fauna that basically drove 8 fantastic sanctuaries for our native animals into liquidation. And there were no anti-regulation campaigners trying to fight that fight. So those are a bunch of things we can do. Here's another innovator who wanted to have property investment where the commission was part withheld based on the performance of the investment property that was sold, and ran into problems. Did this mean that it was did they need a financial services license? Were they selling a derivative? And there's the innovator, or failed innovator in this case. So there are lots of little things that get in the way. And we have this Manichaean idea, this sort of good versus evil approach to regulation. And I think we should be much more like the way Toyota runs its factories, which is continuous improvement, trying to drive intelligence about the system down to the coalface to find lots of little things that we can do to do it better. And we should have active innovation facilitation. Specific areas of regulation, innovation on the NBN. We talk about telemedicine. Well, that's going to get down to occupational regulation and a whole bunch of things like that. Those are the things that we need to go out and tackle in a positive way to make things happen, rather than sit there with our regulatory impact statement and say, no new regulation. And another one, and I'll leave it there, is drug regulation. We spend, on some estimates, $1.3 billion of research for every successful drug, and yet 90% of those costs are in phase 3 trials where safety is frequently not an issue. The issue is efficacy. And if the issue is efficacy, then we ought to be able to build an institution where that efficacy can be tested in the marketplace. And it seems that's not a complicated idea. And I think it's an idea that could be sold to the public if we had leaders who understood it and believed in it, and we would have people beating a path to our doorway. We'd get copied fairly quickly, in fact, but we would get a lot of activity here, and it would be great to have for its own sake and for what it could do for our industry. So that is what I have to say. What is there not to like about this kind of thing? Because if you're wrong, you haven't wasted any decent amount of money. You've tried something and you've got things going. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and happy to take questions.